about False Claims Act potential liability broadly is also the importance of companies having a good internal program for individuals to raise compliance concerns and then for the company to investigate and mitigate them.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. As you know, we're the leading independent, nonpartisan podcast on FDA. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's another installment in our signature multi-episode series that we produced in collaboration with law firms and other organizations. Today's episode is the third in a four-part series that we're doing with one of the truly renowned global food and drug law firms, Covington. This four-part series is called Medical Device Regulation, Compliance, and Policy. We're going to focus, and we have been focusing, on the cutting-edge issues that face medical device companies and FDA stakeholders, including those involved with traditional devices, diagnostics, and, of course, the emergence of digital health. In our first episode, we analyzed diagnostics regulation, including the laboratory-developed tests. In our second installment, we focused on global medical device regulatory issues, particularly in Europe and China. If you haven't heard those episodes, you can hear them by going to our website, fdawatch.net. I will repeat, fdawatch.net. That website also enables you to subscribe for free. And when you subscribe, you get an email whenever we have a new episode. So I urge you and ask you to subscribe if you have not already done so. Today's episode, we're going to take up the issue of false claims. We have just the right guest to address that, so let me introduce them right now. Pam Forrest co-chairs Covington's Medical Device Industry Group. She has more than 30 years of experience advising medical device manufacturers on a broad range of regulatory issues, specific focus on medical device and digital health issues. She's also an expert on FDA enforcement and responding to warning letters. Michael Granston is a partner at Covington. He's chair of the firm's False Claims Act investigations and litigation practice. He recently rejoined Covington. He spent nearly 3 decades at DOJ, the Department of Justice, supervising False Claims Act litigation. Most recently, he was Deputy Assistant Attorney General, the highest ranking career position in the Civil Division. Welcome to FDA Watch, Michael. And third up is Krysten Rosen Moller. She's a partner in Covington's Life Sciences Enforcement practice. She focuses her practice on representing clients in government investigations, False Claims Act, internal investigation, and her practice focuses obviously on life sciences and healthcare. So I want to welcome each of you to FDA Watch, and I want to start out my questions to Krysten and ask her to provide a brief overview for people who might not be familiar with the False Claims Act, and talk about the government's ability to pursue civil fraud claims on behalf of federal health programs. Krysten?
Yeah, thank you, Wayne, and thank you on behalf of all of us for having us here to chat with you today. At a high level, the False Claims Act is a civil statute that was actually enacted during the Civil War to combat fraud against the federal government. The quintessential example from back at its origins was a government contractor selling the government bullets filled with sawdust. And the statute has continued to be used since that time to combat fraud on the government and false claims being submitted to the government. A person can be liable under the FCA, a person or a company, for knowingly submitting false claims to the government or for making false records or statements to get false claims paid by the government. And liability extends not just to those who submit the false claims or the false records, but to persons or companies who cause the submission of false claims or records. And the statute actually provides for treble damages as well as a statutory per claim civil penalties. So, a company or a person who's liable under the False Claims Act could be liable for paying 3 times the damages that are claimed to be at issue, as well as a statutory penalty for every claim that was allegedly false. And as you can imagine, Wayne, in the healthcare context in particular, where there are many claims being submitted for reimbursement for different individuals and their treatments, the per claim civil penalties in these cases could add up very quickly. One of the most interesting things about the False Claims Act is that cases under the False Claims Act could be initiated by the government, either by the Department of Justice, Main Justice, or the U.S. Attorney's offices across the country, or they can be initiated by private individuals who file the claims on behalf of the government. And when private individuals file these claims, they file a complaint. It's kept under seal, not public, where they file it, to allow the government to investigate their allegations and decide whether the government is going to get involved in the case. But even if the government doesn't get involved, that private individual could continue to litigate and pursue the case on behalf of the government.
There was a time when there were a lot of claims against drug companies and device companies brought by whistleblowers, what you just described. Is that, how steady is that occurring? Are most of the cases these days, I'm going to ask Michael the same question in terms of what's going on right now, but what's going on in terms of the whistleblower numbers in bringing cases against companies? Krysten?
Yes, still the whistleblower. These key TAM initiated cases are still very active. Their majority still of claims are initiated by relators filing cases in courts on behalf of the government. And Michael can provide more context on some of those numbers. But it is still a very active part of False Claims Act enforcement activity.
Yeah, Michael, that is my next question to you in terms of what's going on in terms of the government's current use of the False Claims Act in the healthcare area.
Sure. And let me begin by also expressing my appreciation for the opportunity to be here. As Krysten noted, the False Claims Act provides both the government and whistleblowers with a general remedy for pursuing fraud against the public fisc. But I think it's fair to say that since about the mid-1990s, in practice, the False Claims Act has been predominantly used to pursue fraud impacting federal healthcare programs. And the government's recent annual report that it released for its False Claims Act activities for this past fiscal year 2025, just underscores the predominant role that healthcare fraud is playing in the government's overall False Claims Act enforcement efforts. First, in terms of recoveries, last year the government reported more than $6.8 billion recovered under the False Claims Act. And of that amount, more than 83%, or more than $5.7 billion, was recovered in healthcare cases. That's the highest amount of healthcare recoveries in a single year under the False Claims Act. And it also marks the 16th straight year, dating back to 2010, that the government's healthcare recoveries have either been close to or in excess of $2 billion a year. But also to your point about the role that these whistleblower or quitam cases play, the government announced not just record-breaking healthcare recoveries last year, but also announced a record-breaking number of new healthcare matters, a significant portion of which were due to quitam cases. In particular, the government reported 458 new healthcare quitam cases just last year. And separately, the government also reported opening 183 new healthcare cases for a total number of 641 new healthcare fraud investigations just in the last year, which is also a single year record under the False Claims Act.
We've had a new DOJ in the last year, new leadership at the DOJ. Has the new leadership changed the way that the DOJ views False Claims Act liability?
So I would answer that both yes and no. On the one hand, I think the current administration has indicated or reflected a continued commitment to robust False Claims Act enforcement, including in the healthcare arena. And the numbers that I just cited to you in part reflect that continuing commitment and carryover from the prior administration to the current administration, including strong, robust False Claims Act enforcement, again, particularly in the healthcare arena. On the other hand, this past July, the current administration just announced the new creation of a DOJ HHS joint working group to be focused on False Claims Act enforcement. And notably, that new working group has identified some particular enforcement priorities within the healthcare arena, some of which particularly pertain to medical device manufacturers. Now, most of those new priorities are areas that have already been in the past the focus of False Claims Act activity, but I think they do signal a heightened attention to these priority areas, as well as underscoring the current administration's continued commitment to healthcare fraud enforcement.
Let me ask Pam a question. What kinds of preventive actions can device manufacturers take to reduce their exposure to enforcement under the False Claims Act? I'm going to ask all three of you that question, but let me start with Pam here.
Well, thanks, Wayne. And again, I express appreciation for the invitation to join this discussion. In our experience, the best prevention is really to establish and maintain, compliant FDA compliant systems that consistently produce devices that meet their specifications, that deliver the intended effect of the device in a safe and effective manner. I find that periodically subjecting companies to mock audits to ensure compliance with FDA requirements to really kind of try to shake out subpar practices and shortcuts that can ultimately lead to the production of defective devices is really good practice to implement. But I think that firm culture at a device manufacturer is maybe the most critical element to sort of monitor and police. Instilling kind of a patient first, quality driven culture is really essential to reducing FCA enforcement exposure and also reducing the risk of FDA scrutiny. And that's harder to do than implementing compliant procedures and processes. It's something that has to come from top management. The message that choosing quality and patient safety over expediency is the only choice that will be tolerated. So I think that, in my experience, is a longer haul, but can be a great prophylactic measure in decreasing and reducing False Claims Act enforcement exposure. I think in terms of sort of marketing and promotional practices, one of the lessons that I've learned in working with device manufacturers over the years is that there are early steps that can be taken to prevent the creation of incentives to off-label promote. So, for example, I often work with my clients to stimulate collaboration with sales and regulatory teams in the early stages of product development to help them to collectively determine the indications for use that will be pursued to ensure that the clearance or approval that they ultimately obtain from FDA is useful for business purposes and doesn't create frustration and the temptation to promote off-label, which again can be a trigger for False Claims Act enforcement. I also find it's, of course, important to have in place a tightly controlled process for developing and approving promotional claims. And it's very helpful to conduct robust training for sales reps on FDA promotional requirements and the consequences of off-label promotion. So those are just kind of a handful of lessons learned over the years that we've helped companies to employ to reduce their overall exposure.
Yeah, and a lot of corporate integrity agreements that are signed as a consequence of False Claims Act cases require training. Talk a little bit about what you do when you go into a company and do training. How do you approach that?
I'm a firm believer in being explicit and people joke, but instilling fear, so to speak. So, we work through, and I often, come in and train not just the regulatory department, but the sales folks as well, about the FDA process, what it means to get clearance for specific indications for use. That a general indication doesn't give you license to promote a specific indication, and sort of the underlying policy rationales for why promotion has to be confined to the cleared or approved indications for use. And we talk explicitly about the FDA and DOJ consequences of off-label promotion. So I think it's important to not shield the sales reps from sort of the reality of enforcement exposure, and it's something we do with regularity.
Krysten and Michael, I want to give you a chance to add whatever you want to Pam's answer, which was pretty comprehensive, as we all saw. But anything to add to what she said?
I guess the thing that I would add, Wayne, if you think about False Claims Act, potential liability broadly, is also the importance of companies having a good internal program for individuals to raise compliance concerns, and then for the company to investigate and mitigate them. As I mentioned, a lot of these cases can be started by individuals who are raising claims on behalf of the government. And often what we see is that these individuals have raised concerns internally to the company and may not have felt like they were investigated well enough or addressed. And so having a robust program for fielding concerns that are raised and investigating them and remediating them where necessary is another good step that companies can take in order to sort of mitigate the risk of False Claims Act liability.
Michael, anything to add?
Just real quickly to build upon sort of what Krysten and Pam already said, it's important in my view to make sure that when you discover any type of problem, you remediate or disclose as appropriate quickly. One of the hallmarks of the element of knowledge under the False Claims Act is whether or not you are aware of a substantial risk and then ignored it. That's the standard the government is going to be looking at when it decides whether or not, if a problem existed and if you became aware of a problem, whether or not ultimately your conduct subjects yourself to False Claims Act liability. And so if you do become aware of a problem, addressing it quickly, appropriately, disclosing it as necessary, can then avoid this situation where you're alleged to have been aware of a problem or even a potential problem, and again, having failed to ignore or respond in a timely fashion.
When the government started to aggressively enforce the False Claims Act several decades ago, there was a change, I think, in the way that companies hired people. And let me ask, Pam, let me start with you. What do you advise an HR person within a company, device company, to watch out for, to make sure that reduce the likelihood that a new hire is going to be potentially a whistleblower? Are there any special advice that you give them?
I have to say I focus more on ensuring that the compliance profile of the company is such that it doesn't create the circumstances for a whistleblower to exist. I think certainly there are serial whistleblowers, and to the extent that HR can detect that can be helpful. But I think in my experience, sort of the greater measure of success or promoting success is to, again, create that culture of compliance such that, as Krysten said, first, if there is an issue, there is an infrastructure to allow reporting of it. And then, but even more importantly, that the compliance structure is there such that everyone understands how to comply, that the company has put quality first. And I think, again, that's the cultural issue. I think it's less about preventing the invitation to whistleblow. It's more about creating the circumstances such that there's nothing to whistleblow about.
Right. The proverbial culture of compliance.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break now, but we'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking to Pam Forrest, Michael Granston, and Krysten Rosen Moller of Covington. Let's get back into talking about the False Claims Act, especially as it affects the medical device industry. We talked about whistleblowers. I understand there are currently a series of cases challenging the constitutionality of the False Claims Act whistleblower provisions. Michael, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, as Kristen mentioned, the False Claims Act has this unique provision that allows whistleblowers not only to file suit on behalf of the United States in the first instance, but even to pursue those cases on their own if the United States decides not to join and take over the suit. Recently, several Supreme Court justices have raised questions about whether this framework, which again allows whistleblowers to pursue cases without the United States, violates the Constitution. And those questions that were raised by individual justices in turn have sparked a number of defendants to challenge the constitutionality of the whistleblower provisions in cases where the government declined to intervene and the relators have been pursuing the cases on their own. And while most of these challenges have been rejected by the courts, there was one district court recently in Florida in a case called U.S. Ex rel. Zafirov versus Florida Medical Associates that ruled that the whistleblower provisions are unconstitutional. In that particular case, the United States decided not to join the whistleblower's suit, which raised various Medicare fraud allegations. And the whistleblower then proceeded to litigate the case on her own. The defendant, in turn, argued that it was unconstitutional for the relator to continue to litigate the case. And without getting too technical, the defendant argued that under Article 2 of the Constitution, there are various provisions that effectively require claims being brought on behalf of the United States to be brought by the president or people answerable to the president. And so the defendant argued that because the whistleblower doesn't qualify under those provisions, that the whistleblower pursuing the case on her own, again, violated the Constitution. The district court agreed with the defendant and found that it was unconstitutional for the whistleblower to proceed. And the whistleblower has now appealed the case to the 11th Circuit, and that is where the case is currently pending. I'll note that depending upon how the 11th Circuit comes out, if it were to uphold the district court's ruling and to find that the whistleblower provisions are unconstitutional, it could have some significant ripple effects on the False Claims Act landscape. At a minimum, it would mean that whistleblowers would not be allowed to pursue these declined cases where the United States decides not to join the suit, at least in the 11th Circuit, where the case is currently located, which includes Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. But perhaps the even more significant potential impact here is, depending upon exactly how the appellate court rules, if it were to find the quitan provisions unconstitutional, it could draw into question whether or not whistleblowers can file quitan cases at all, even in cases in which the government decided to intervene. And that truly would be a significant change to the False Claims Act landscape, given, as we discussed earlier, how pervasive quitan cases have been in the government's enforcement of the False Claims Act.
Let's move on to another area, kickbacks. Kickbacks are a potential source of liability for device manufacturers under the False Claims Act. Krysten, are there any new developments with respect to the government's ability to pursue False Claims Act liability for kickbacks that device manufacturers should be aware of?
Yes. So kickbacks cases are one of the most prominent areas for False Claims Act enforcement. They are a subject of the priority areas for the government, and they are also an area that QTAM relators tend to bring a lot of suits related to. And for many years, False Claims Act cases that have been premised on the anti-kickback statute violations or kickback violations, they've been pursued based on language that is specifically in the anti-kickback statute that was added to the statute in 2010. And that language says that claims are false for purposes of the False Claims Act if they result from violations of the anti-kickback statute. And so for many years, cases have been pursued under this language, and the government and the key tam relators have argued that a claim results from an anti-kickback statute violation and so fits within that provision as long as it's somehow tainted by that violation. And courts and plaintiffs have described what that requires in all sorts of ways, but it hadn't been viewed as that high of a barrier. But over the past several years, three different circuit courts, the Eighth, Sixth, and most recently the First Circuit, have said that claims only result from anti-kickback statute violations and therefore fit under that statutory provision if the particular item or service would not have been part of the claim but for the illegal kickback. And so but for causation had to be proven in these cases. This sets up a circuit split on the issue with an earlier decision from the Third Circuit and sets up a much higher burden for plaintiffs to show that claims actually resulted from a kickback statute violation. The cases kind of employing this standard are currently being litigated at various different stages, and they'll help define what the precise contours will be of what is and is not sufficient to establish but for causation. And also, the theories of liability are shifting based on this decision to look for other ways to allege that claims are false under the False Claims Act based on alleged kickbacks. And so this is going to be an interesting area to watch develop over the coming years. We're litigating some of these cases with these issues. They're being litigated across the country, and they're going to be important for device manufacturers to consider because this is such a ripe area for False Claims Act enforcement.
And I want to ask you about I asked Michael before, but let me ask you as well about the current environment. The False Claims Act, as you said, comes out of the Civil War. Of course, only for the past few decades has the government been aggressively using it in terms of the healthcare industries. You would think that companies would have compliance programs in place, that they would try to create a culture of compliance, that they would understand the huge financial and perhaps criminal liability. How do you see compliance? I'll ask Krysten first and then the others. How is compliance within the medical device industry? How would you assess it?
Yeah, I think companies do have a culture of compliance. And the interesting thing in this space is that healthcare is evolving. So the types of offerings that device manufacturers have, the types of support that they may want to provide, the different levels of the healthcare marketplace, and how one company that might be a purchaser or a distributor in one context might also be a provider in another context, and how the healthcare industry is becoming more matrix. All of these sort of new elements to the industry layer on complexity into determining, and evaluating whether something might present risk under the False Claims Act or under the anti-kickback statute. So if you look at kind of very traditional, what were kickbacks, money being paid to a doctor to prescribe your drug, I think that very simple kind of hypothetical is very well addressed by many companies in their compliance programs. But when you take those same contexts and layer it onto a much more complicated healthcare marketplace and much more complicated healthcare offerings, that's where I think there is an opportunity to potentially have footfalls.
Michael, any perspective on that?
I think that's exactly right, is that as these sort of schemes that the government pursues evolve, expand, become more complicated, I think one of the challenges for companies and their compliance programs is just to sort of sensitize folks that there may be potential liability arising out of situations that before perhaps we might not thought of as being potential areas for False Claims Act liability. So the goal is to sort of be creative and proactive in your compliance programs and in your thinking about what types of conduct the government might consider to be the basis for False Claims Act liability, even again, if it wasn't a traditional basis for liability. And I just wanted to add, turning back to the kickback question, the importance of sort of the current debate over what constitutes a basis for False Claims Act liability under kickbacks is particularly notable in light of the fact that one of the specific enforcement priorities identified by this new DOJ HHS working group is kickbacks related to medical devices. So those folks in the medical device world do need to be concerned in particular about the payment of kickbacks. And again, as Krysten noted, it's not just your standard kickback of directorship fees or meals and entertainment, but they need to think more broadly about what type of remuneration might nonetheless be viewed as falling within the scope of the Kickback Act and therefore exposing themselves to potential False Claims Act liability.
Final question, open-ended question. What haven't we covered? You've covered a lot in the False Claims Act. And I hope that the listeners to this podcast have gained an enormous, better understanding of what's going on with this important law. But let me again start with Krysten. Anything else that we should have covered I haven't asked you about?
Sure, Wayne. I'll just add on one note. So we talked a little bit about the kickback-based False Claims Act claims, and I think we've mentioned some other possible theories of liability. For example, marketing a device for an unapproved use could potentially give rise to False Claims Act liability. And that raises an interesting question about the interplay between the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the False Claims Act. And it's worth just flagging that because, folks listening today might have a lot of familiarity and be engaged on sort of FDCA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act issues, and be wondering how that might interplay with the False Claims Act liability we've talked about today. At base, there's conduct that can be a violation of the FDCA that may also be a basis for False Claims Act liability, like the examples I just gave of the marketing for an unapproved use. But the False Claims Act is not an all-purpose anti-fraud statute or vehicle for punishing sort of garden variety regulatory violations. And numerous courts have held that the fact that a product is adulterated or misbranded as a regulatory matter under the FDCA does not mean that the claim is false for purposes of the False Claims Act. And similarly, the government has said that a violation of the FDCA's misbranding provisions is not itself a basis for treating claims as false for the purposes of the False Claims Act. And what's really at issue in the False Claims Act is whether the claim is false, whether it is a claim that is reimbursable under the various rules and regulations for reimbursability by government healthcare payers. And so it's just something to be attuned to and to think about as you're dealing with these issues, that it's not a one for one, but something to consider where there might be potential overlap.
Michael, let me ask you the same question I asked Krysten. What haven't we covered?
The one additional point I would just underscore for our listeners is that the Department of Justice recently has indicated that in the medical device space, one of the primary issues that they're going to be looking at is defective device issues. And in particular, whether or not there were devices that were materially defective in a way that may jeopardize patient health and safety. And they've underscored that it isn't just actual harm they'll be looking at, but rather the risk of harm and the potential that a device may have impacted patient health and safety. That will be one of the factors they'll be considering in deciding whether to bring claims against device manufacturers.
That is an important development because, we've been talking for a while about the False Claims Act. It seems as though most of the impact is financial, economic, rather than health related. But you're raising the issue that the government may now be looking at the impact on the health of individuals.
Yes, I think they've sort of stated that in viewing what are material violations of the False Claims Act, one of the key factors they will be looking at is exactly what you just mentioned, Wayne. Is there some corresponding potential health and safety impact on patients themselves?
Pam, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Krysten and Michael. What haven't we covered that you'd like to cover?
I would probably just springboard off of the points that Kristen was making that, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between the False Claims Act and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so, you often don't get sort of an early warning sign in terms of FDA scrutiny as a precedent or predicate to a False Claims Act enforcement action. And it may be that the FDA gets interested later or not at all. So I think there may be sometimes a misunderstanding that those two go hand in hand, but you don't necessarily get that early warning sign.
Okay. One final question. I just put it out there. We've talked a lot about the False Claims Act as it relates to device companies. Would you say the same thing if we were talking about drug companies? We have a large audience that is in the drug field. Let me again start with Krysten there. The same things apply to the drug industry as well. Is that not true?
It is true. The same things that we've talked about in terms of, potential areas for enforcement activity, government enforcement priorities, and the issues with kickbacks and various things we've talked about today would apply equally, in my view, in the pharmaceutical manufacturing space.
Michael, Pam, any perspective on that?
I wholly concur. And in fact, again, if you go back to the working group's announcement of their priority areas, most of them talk about both drugs and devices together. And so when they're identifying their priorities about whether it's defective or whether we're kickbacks or pricing related issues, again, they refer both to drugs and devices. So I think we're talking about the same risks applying across the board to both types of entities or manufacturers.
Well, I hope that what emerges from this podcast is the concept of a culture of compliance. That's very important. That terminology has become common in the device area and in the drug area. Clearly, the liability remains and the aggressiveness of the federal government remains. On that note, I want to thank Michael and Pam and Krysten for educating us so much about what's really happening in regard to false claims. This is, again, the third installment of this 4-part series that we're doing in collaboration with Covington. I'd like to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin-Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind you to subscribe, fdawatch.net, and it's free, and you will get a notice whenever we post an episode. Again, fdawatch.net. And we know you don't want to miss the final installment of the series or any episode. There's no way to guarantee that you won't miss it unless you subscribe. Our podcast continues to grow. We now have more than 15,000 downloads. That's because so many people have chosen to be subscribers. So again, I urge you to subscribe. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.